Seems every day we continue to talk about the same topics surrounding Ukraine: more building takeovers by anti-Kiev opposition, more sanctions from the West, and more of a military buildup. I asked Anton Fedyashin what to make of all of this. He's the head of American University's Initiative for Russian Culture.
Well, the EU seems to be following America's lead in terms of imposing sanctions. But the biggest difference between the U.S. and the EU is that the U.S. sanctions are a lot more far-reaching than those that the European Union is willing to apply. And there's a very easy way to explain that. The EU's trade balance and trade turnover with Russia is almost 11 times the size of the U.S. So the Europeans have a lot more to lose from their own sanctions than the Americans do.
You were also saying to me that the narrative is not Ukraine. There's a narrative from the West and the East. And, let's take Russia, for example. Russia says NATO's making these provocative moves. The U.S. and the West, their message is, we're going to slap Russia with sanctions. It seems as though Ukraine's the football being tossed back and forth, but Ukraine is not the focus.
Absolutely, and this is especially true in the West, where Ukraine policy seems to be led by considerations of how to punish Russia, not considerations how to throw a lifeline, an economic lifeline to Ukraine in order to help it weather the fundamental crisis that brought all of this mess about, which is economic at its foundation. So the Russians have, at least, while also pursuing their geopolitical and national security interests, have also offered the Ukrainians the overwhelming amount of aid of any of the parties involved in the crisis. So we'll see how this turns out.
Let me ask you about this lawlessness we're seeing, an assassination attempt against the mayor, these protests which have turned violent. As you witness this from the West, watching this, what's your greatest fear at this stage?
Well, the greatest fear right now is that the situation in eastern Ukraine will spin completely out of control and descend into violence that neither the Kiev government nor the local authorities, more importantly, can control. And what we always forget about when it comes to violence and the events in eastern Ukraine is the role of the local oligarchs in sparking that violence and attempting to direct it, because they have an interest in both destabilizing the eastern part of the country in order to have a better position from which to negotiate with Kiev, but also from controlling that violence and that chaos so that the whole place doesn't implode into a civil war. The central government can do one thing, and I think it's the overriding importance. It needs to start negotiating with its own people in the East, including the secessionists, separatists, as they're called, because without negotiating with representatives of all of the splinter groups in the eastern part of the country, I don't see how the central government in Kiev can even pretend to be legitimate, because its legitimacy is not recognized by over 2/3 of the people in eastern Ukraine. Most of those, by the way, do not want to join Russia, but they don't trust Kiev anyway. And that's the mind-boggling complexity with which the Kiev government has completely failed to deal with so far.
And as you look at internal and external, the major message I'm hearing from you is each side is talking past each other. No one seems to be listening.
Very much so. The interesting, the ironic thing about all of this is that the Russians so far have been the ones to offer the most economic aid to Ukraine, but economic aid comes with conditions from all sides. And so far, the Russians have been the most patient and the most moderate. Let's remember that the Ukrainians owe the Russians over $2.2 billion in back payments for gas, and the Russians have not turned off the spigot. They have not used the biggest economic lever that they have so far.
Anton, always a pleasure. Thanks so much for coming in.
Thank you very much for having me.